My name is Anya Sterling, and at 31 years old, I stand guard over the secrets of the United States of America. It's a life I chose, a life of rigid discipline and unyielding honor, a world away from the perfumed diplomacy and silken lies of my family. I never expected that the very fortress I built to escape them would one day be the only place in the world they could run to for salvation, or that the path they scorned as brutish and beneath them would become their only hope. The story of how my parents, the esteemed Richard and Eleanor Sterling, came to beg for entry into my world is one of ironies so sharp they could cut glass. Before I reveal what finally broke their pride and forced them to see the daughter they had disowned, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt like the black sheep of your family, or felt like your choices were misunderstood, go ahead and hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe to join our community of people who understand that sometimes, the family you choose is the one that truly matters. The Sterling family crest, a pompous little thing with a self-important eagle clutching a quill, was etched into everything. The dinner napkins, the letterhead, the heavy silver signet ring my father wore. It was meant to symbolize a legacy of intellect, influence, and soft power wielded in the quiet, carpeted halls of global diplomacy. My earliest memories are steeped in the scent of old leather, lemon polish, and the clinking of crystal glasses at dinner parties where conversations flowed in 3 different languages. My mother, Eleanor, was the architect of this world. She moved through it with the grace of a ballerina and the strategic mind of a chess grandmaster. To her, image was not just everything, it was the only thing. My father, Richard, was the face of the dynasty, the CEO of Sterling Global Strategies, a consulting firm that advised governments and shaped international policy from the comfort of a skyscraper in Manhattan. And then there was my brother, Julian. He was the heir, the golden boy, born with the Sterling crest seemingly tattooed on his soul. He was charming, brilliant, and effortlessly slid into the mold our parents had cast for him. And then there was me. I was the glitch in their perfect portrait. From a young age I was different. While Julian was mastering Latin and dazzling his tutors, I was climbing the tallest trees in our country estate, coming home with skinned knees and dirt under my fingernails. While he was winning debate tournaments, I was spending hours in the dusty attic with my grandfather's old footlocker. He was a veteran, a man who had seen the world not through the tinted window of a diplomatic motorcade, but through the grit and grime of a landing craft at Normandy. He passed away when I was 10, but his legacy was my secret inheritance. His medals, tarnished and heavy, felt more real in my hand than any of my mother's diamond necklaces. He had left me his journals, filled not with discussions of policy, but with stories of camaraderie, of depending on the person next to you with your life, of an honor that was earned in mud and sweat, not bestowed by a title. My parents saw this as a phase, a childish rebellion they were certain they could polish away. They tried. Lord, how they tried. They enrolled me in finishing schools, where I learned to curtsy and pour tea with a straight back, all while my mind was calculating the best way to scale the ivy-covered walls outside. They pushed me toward degrees in international relations and political science at Georgetown, a Sterling tradition. I went because I was still a girl who desperately wanted her parents' approval, but my heart was never in it. I found the endless discussions of sanctions and treaties to be a sterile, bloodless affair. It was a world of words, of nuanced threats and veiled promises, and I craved something tangible. Craved action. I craved a purpose that felt solid beneath my feet. The breaking point came at one of my mother's infamous dinner parties. I was 20, home from university for the holidays. The guest of honor was a French ambassador, a man whose face was a mask of polite boredom. The air was thick with smug self-congratulation. My father was holding court, pontificating about a trade deal he had brokered. Julian was at his side, nodding sagely, a perfect miniature of our father. I was seated at the far end of the table, next to a senator's wife who only wanted to talk about fabric swatches for her new summer home. I felt like I was suffocating. At one point, my mother directed a question down the table, her voice carrying a brittle edge of performance. "Anya, dear, Do tell Monsieur Du Bois about your thesis on post-Soviet trade agreements. I opened my mouth, the practiced words feeling like ash. But before I could speak, my father laughed, a dismissive, airy sound. Oh, Eleanor, let's not bore the ambassador. Anya's interests are a bit more rustic. She's been spending her time at the university's climbing gym, of all things. Preparing to scale the walls of the Kremlin, perhaps. The table chuckled politely. My mother's smile was a thin, painted line of disappointment. She looked at me as if I were a stain on her pristine tablecloth. In that moment something inside me snapped. It wasn't loud. It was a quiet, cold severance. I realized then that I would never be what they wanted. I could get perfect grades, I could write the most brilliant thesis, but I would always be a disappointment because my soul wasn't made of the same material as theirs. A week later, I walked into a U.S. Marine Corps recruiting office in a strip mall miles away from the polished marble of Georgetown. The air inside smelled of coffee and cleaning solution. The walls were covered in posters of Marines in dress blues and combat gear. A staff sergeant with sharp, intelligent eyes and a handshake like a vice grip sat me down. She didn't talk about influence or legacy. She talked about honor, courage, and commitment. She spoke of a brotherhood and sisterhood forged in shared hardship, of a standard so high that few could meet it. She spoke of service, not as a means to power, but as an end in itself. For the first time I felt like I was hearing my native language. I felt like I had come home. The ensuing confrontation with my parents was apocalyptic. I waited until I had signed the papers, until it was a done deal. I told them in my father's study, the same room where he'd taken calls from presidents and prime ministers. The silence that followed my announcement was heavier than any I had ever experienced. Then my mother spoke, her voice a horrified whisper. A Marine. You want to be a grunt. Anya, have you lost your mind? That is a life for other people. Not for a sterling. It's brutish. It's common. My father's reaction was more explosive. He slammed his hand on his mahogany desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. You are throwing your life away. Your education. Your name. What will we tell people? That our daughter is crawling through the mud with hooligans. He saw it not as a choice for my life, but as a direct public assault on his. If you do this, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, you are no longer a part of this family. We will not support this. You will be on your own. I remember looking at them, at their faces contorted with anger and embarrassment, and feeling a strange, hollow sort of peace. They weren't angry because they were worried for my safety. They were angry because I was ruining their image. I had become an inconvenient truth in their carefully curated world. I know, I said quietly. That's the point. I walked out of that room and out of their lives. That night, I packed a small bag, leaving behind the designer clothes and the pearl earrings they had given me for my 18th birthday. The only thing I took was my grandfather's journal. On the bus to Paris Island, I read a passage I had memorized. Honor is not what people think of you. It's what you know about yourself when you're alone in the dark. Paris Island was hell, but it was a righteous hell. They broke me down. They stripped away every last vestige of Anya Sterling, the diplomat's daughter. They shaved my head. They screamed in my face until I was nothing but a trembling collection of failures. And then, slowly, meticulously, they built me back up. They built a Marine. I learned to shoot, to navigate, to fight. But more than that, I learned to rely on the woman to my left and the woman to my right. I learned that trust wasn't a commodity to be negotiated, but a bond sealed in sweat and shared misery. I discovered a strength in myself I never knew I had. It wasn't the soft political strength of my family. It was a hard, unyielding strength, forged in the crucible of shared purpose. My first duty station was Okinawa. My second was a brief stint in Germany. The occasional stilted phone calls with my family were exercises in mutual frustration. They'd ask about my little adventure, as if it were a gap year backpacking through Europe. They couldn't comprehend my life, and they didn't try. Julian was the only one who made a token effort, sending occasional emails filled with news of his latest promotion at my father's firm, as if to highlight the gulf between our worlds. The unspoken message was always clear. When are you going to give this up and come home? But I had a home. It was in the barracks, in the mess hall, in the quiet confidence of my fellow Marines. I excelled. I was a natural leader, my disciplined mind finding a perfect home in the structure of the Corps. I was promoted to corporal, then to sergeant. I put in for the Marine Security Guard program, one of the most prestigious and demanding duties a Marine can undertake. It required a flawless record, psychological stability, and an almost fanatical devotion to duty. It was the Marine Corps' version of diplomacy, but our currency wasn't words. It was unwavering vigilance and, if necessary, the decisive application of force. My parents would have found it ironic if they had bothered to care. I was becoming a diplomat after all, just not their kind. I was going to guard the very embassies they frequented, but I would be one of the brutish figures in uniform they always looked past, a part of the scenery. The training was intense, culminating in a final test at a mock embassy in Quantico. It was there I first served under Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Thorne. He was a legend in the MSG community, a man who seemed to be carved from granite and cynicism. He had seen everything from embassy overruns to political coups. He saw through my polished Georgetown accent on day one. He rode me harder than anyone else, testing my limits, pushing me until I was ready to collapse. He wasn't doing it to be cruel. He was doing it to see if I had what it took. One day, after a brutal 18-hour training exercise, he pulled me aside. I was covered in sweat and grime, my muscles screaming. I thought he was going to tear me apart for some minor infraction. He just looked at me, his gaze level. "Sterling," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You're not like the others. You think too much. But you've got a fire in you. Don't ever let anyone put it out. Especially not yourself." It was the most profound praise I had ever received. It was worth more than every hollow compliment my parents had ever given me. My first MSG posting was the U.S. Embassy in the Republic of Kovadia. It was a geopolitical hotspot, a volatile nation teetering on the brink of civil war. The capital city, Khazar, was a paradox of ancient beauty and modern tension. Ornate mosques stood beside crumbling Soviet-era apartment blocks. The air hummed with the energy of a powder keg waiting for a spark. The embassy was a modern fortress, a concrete and steel island of American sovereignty in a sea of uncertainty. I was the detachment commander, in charge of a small, elite unit of Marines responsible for the internal security of the embassy. My world was one of access lists, security protocols, and constant nerve-wracking vigilance. We were the final line of defense. Post 1, the main lobby, was the public face of our security. It was a sterile, intimidating space of marble and bulletproof glass, designed to awe and intimidate. Behind that glass, a Marine stood guard 24/7. From my office, I could see the entire compound on a bank of monitors. I knew every blind spot, every protocol, every possible vulnerability. This fortress was my domain. I was good at my job. I was respected. My Marines, like the young and eager Corporal Davis, looked to me for guidance. Gunny Thorne, who was now stationed in Frankfurt as the regional commander, would check in periodically. His gruff, "Stay sharp, Sterling," was the only approval I needed. I'd found my purpose. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. My family knew I was in Kovadia. They had a vested interest. Sterling Global Strategies was on the verge of closing the biggest deal in its history, a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure and resource-sharing agreement with the Canadian government. It was my father's magnum opus, the culmination of a decade of negotiations. It would secure their legacy for generations. We had a video call about a month before everything went sideways. It was the usual painful dance. My mother, looking impossibly chic in her Manhattan apartment, asked if I was eating properly. My father, impatient and distracted, wanted to know if I'd heard any chatter on the ground about his deal. They didn't ask about me, about my life, about the danger. They saw my posting only through the lens of how it related to them. "The signing ceremony is next month," my father had said, a rare note of excitement in his voice. "The Canadian Prime Minister and I will be signing the final accord. It's a treaty-level document, requires wet ink signatures and physical notarization. No digital shortcuts for this one." Julian was on the call too, looking proud. "It's going to be a historic day for the company, Anya. For the family." I just nodded. "Try to stay out of the way, dear," my mother added, as if I were a toddler who might wander into traffic. "We wouldn't want any incidents." The call ended, and I was left staring at a blank screen, the familiar ache of being an outsider in my own family settling in my chest. But then I looked around my office, at the crisp flag hanging on the wall, at the duty roster filled with the names of the Marines who depended on me. And the ache faded. This was my world. This was real. The situation in Cavadia deteriorated with breathtaking speed. Started with protests, then riots. The government, a fragile coalition propped up by outside interests, responded with brutal force. The spark hit the powder keg. A charismatic opposition leader was arrested, and the city erupted. From the embassy rooftop, we could see plumes of smoke rising from different parts of Khazar. The distant pop-pop-pop of gunfire became a constant, unnerving soundtrack. The ambassador put the embassy on high alert. We drilled our lockdown procedures until they were muscle memory. We were ready. One Tuesday morning it happened. The Canadian government, in a desperate bid to regain control, declared martial law. The borders were sealed. The airport was shut down. A citywide curfew was imposed, enforced by soldiers with shoot-on-sight orders. Khazar became a ghost town overnight. The only sounds were the wind and the wail of distant sirens. The embassy was now truly an island, a hermetically sealed world. We were safe, but we were trapped. And so was everyone else. I knew, with a sinking certainty, what this meant for my father's deal. The signing was scheduled for that Thursday, in just 48 hours. The news must have hit the Sterling headquarters like a missile. I could picture the panic, the frantic calls. My father's legacy, his magnum opus, was trapped on the wrong side of a military lockdown. For the next 24 hours, my family must have exhausted every option. I could imagine my father calling in every favor he was owed, trying to get a private jet cleared for landing, only to be told the airspace was a no-fly zone. I could imagine my mother trying to leverage old diplomatic contacts, only to find their influence meant nothing in the face of martial law. The Canadian partners they were meant to meet were trapped in their own homes, unable to move. The physical documents, the treaty that required a wet ink signature, were useless if the signatories couldn't meet. The deadline was a ticking clock. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon. Not on my personal cell phone, which was useless anyway with the local towers down, but on the secure line in my office, a direct link to the State Department Operations Center in Washington. Corporal Davis buzzed me. "Ma'am, a priority call for you. It's from State Ops, but they're patching through a civilian. A Mr. Richard Sterling." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Picked up the receiver. The line was crystal clear, a sterile connection across thousands of miles of chaos. "This is Sergeant Sterling. Anya, it's your father." His voice was strained, stripped of its usual confident baritone. It was the voice of a man who was losing. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. The Cavadia deal is collapsing. The lockdown has made it impossible for us to meet with our partners. The deadline is tomorrow at noon Khazar time." He was trying to sound authoritative, like he was giving an order. It was his default setting. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before I replied, my voice calm and professional, the voice I used for official business. "I'm aware of the security situation in the city, sir." The "sir" was deliberate. It was protocol, but it was also a wall. "Don't sir me, Anya. This is your father. I need you to do something. I need you to get my partners, the Minister of Commerce, to the embassy. You can move in the city. Your vehicles are armored. You can get him. You can bring him to us." He said it as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. As if I could just dispatch a multi-million-dollar armored vehicle and a team of highly trained Marines to act as his personal Uber service. "Father," I said, my voice still level, "I'm afraid that's not possible. The embassy is on lockdown. We are not authorized to conduct any operations outside the compound except in a dire emergency involving American citizens." "This is a dire emergency," he thundered, his composure cracking. "Billions of dollars are at stake. Decades of work. This is important. The safety of my Marines is important," I countered, my voice hardening slightly. "The security of this embassy is important. Those are my only priorities." I could hear my mother in the background. Her voice a frantic whisper. Then she was on the line, her tone a cloying mix of sweetness and manipulation. "Anya, darling, please. Be reasonable. Think of what this means for the family. For your father. After everything we've done for you, the education, the opportunities. Surely you can do this one small thing for us." The hypocrisy of it was breathtaking. The education they scorned me for wasting. The opportunities one had walked away from because they were suffocating me. "Mother," I said, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. "My duties are to the United States government, not to sterling global strategies. I cannot and will not violate protocol." There was a long, terrible silence on the line. I could hear my father's ragged breathing. The power dynamic, the one that had governed my entire life, was shifting. It was flowing through that secure line, away from their skyscraper in Manhattan and into my small, functional office in a city under siege. They had always held all the cards. The money, the influence, the approval I had so desperately craved. But in this moment, in this very specific crisis, their cards were worthless. I held the only card that mattered. I held the keys to the fortress. When my father spoke again, his voice was broken. The thunder was gone, replaced by the hollow rasp of desperation. "Anya, please." That one word. Please. I had waited my entire life to hear that word from him. To hear a request instead of a demand. I had imagined it would feel triumphant, a surge of victory. But hearing it now, all I felt was a profound, aching sadness for the man on the other end of the line. A man so powerful in his own world, now reduced to begging his estranged daughter for help. "Please," he said again, softer this time. "My legacy. It's all going to turn to dust. Is that what you want? To see me fail?" "What I want," I said, and my voice was finally my own, not a Marine's, not a daughter's, but mine, "is for you to understand. This world that you called brutish, this life you called common. It has rules. It has an order you can't buy or influence. Here your name means nothing. Your money means nothing. Only duty matters." I let that sink in. I could hear my mother weeping softly. "State your request," I said, my voice once again cool and official. "According to protocol." My father, the great Richard Sterling, took a shaky breath. We are formally requesting emergency diplomatic assistance. We need to transport one Canadian national, Minister Al-Hamzi, and 2 of his aides from their residence to a secure location for the signing of a document vital to American strategic interests. We need the U.S. Embassy." He had to force the words out. He had to ask for entry into my world on my terms. I looked out my window at the quiet, tense city. I thought of the girl with skinned knees, the recruit on Paris Island, the sergeant who had earned the respect of men like Gunny Thorne. I had the power to say no. I could let his legacy turn to dust, and a part of me, the hurt little girl inside, screamed to do it. But the Marine in me, the woman I had become, knew better. Vengeance was a shallow victory. Upholding my duty, even for them, was the truer form of honor. "Your request is acknowledged," I said into the phone. "I will authorize a diplomatic extraction for Minister Al-Hamzi and his aides. They will be brought to the embassy. You and your legal team will be permitted to enter the compound to meet them. You will be subject to all standard security screening procedures. You will follow my team's instructions to the letter. There will be no negotiation and no special treatment. Is that understood?" The silence on the other end was my answer. It was the sound of a world turned upside down. "Yes," my father whispered. "Understood." I hung up the phone, my hand steady. The war was over. I hadn't won. I'd just survived. The operation was a textbook example of marine efficiency. I planned the route myself, a circuitous path through back alleys and secondary roads, avoiding the main thoroughfares where Canadian Army patrols were thickest. I personally briefed the team I was sending out, 4 of my best Marines in a hulking, up-armored Suburban that was essentially a tank on wheels. Corporal Davis, his young face set with grim determination, was on the primary rifle. I would be on comms, a voice from the sky directing their every move from the embassy's tactical operations center. They rolled out through the Sally Port just after dawn, a gray ghost slipping into a sleeping city. The next hour was one of the most tense of my life. I watched their progress on a satellite map, listening to the calm, professional chatter on the radio. Checkpoint ahead. Rerouting to alternate 3. Package is secure. The package was Minister Al-Hamzi and his 2 terrified aides, bundled into the vehicle with military precision. My parents and their lawyer arrived shortly after, not in an armored vehicle, but in a standard diplomatic car that had been dispatched to their 5-star hotel, now a gilded cage. The hotel was in the Green Zone, a small, heavily guarded district, but even getting from there to the embassy was a risk. I watched their arrival on the security monitors. The big steel gate of the embassy slid open, and their car drove into the Sally Port, a concrete box where vehicles are inspected before being allowed into the compound proper. The gate slid shut behind them, trapping them. Then the inner gate remained closed. This was protocol. This was my world. I saw them get out of the car. My father, always so impeccably dressed, looked rumpled and small. My mother's perfectly coiffed hair was slightly disheveled, her face pale with fear. Julian was with them. His usual confident swagger completely gone. He just looked scared. I didn't go to greet them. That would have been a personal gesture, and this was not a personal visit. I sent Corporal Davis and another Marine, both armed and in full combat gear. "Sir, ma'am, please step over here," Davis said, his voice polite but firm. "We need to conduct a security screening. All electronic devices, including phones and watches, must be surrendered. Please place all bags on the table." My mother looked horrified, as if she'd been asked to strip naked. "Surely this isn't necessary," she began. "It's protocol, ma'am," Davis said, his expression unreadable. My father, to his credit, just nodded grimly and placed his phone in the plastic bin. He understood. He was no longer in charge. Julian followed suit, his eyes darting around the sterile, intimidating space, finally landing on the camera high in the corner where he knew I was watching. He held my gaze for a moment, and in his eyes, I saw a flicker of something new, a mixture of shame and awe. They were escorted through a metal detector and then led through the blast-proof doors into Post 1. The lobby was empty except for the lone Marine standing guard behind the thick ballistic glass. The silence was absolute. This was the fortress they had paid for with their taxes but had never truly seen. This was the brutish world that was now their only sanctuary. I met them in the hallway that led to the conference rooms. I was in my uniform, the camouflage pattern crisp, my boots shined to a mirror finish. I was flanked by my gunnery sergeant, who had come in from the Marine House to oversee the operation. I was the very image of the authority they had dismissed. My mother's face was a complicated mask of relief, resentment, and a flicker of fear. My father couldn't quite meet my eyes. He looked at the rank insignia on my collar, then at the floor. "The minister is secure in conference room 2, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "You and your legal counsel will use conference room 3. The minister and his aides will be brought to you one at a time for the signing. You have 60 minutes. My Marines will be present in the room at all times. Once the documents are signed and notarized by the embassy's consular officer, you will be escorted back to your vehicle. Are there any questions?" My father just shook his head. My mother opened her mouth to say something, then closed it again. It was Julian who spoke, his voice quiet. "Thank you, Anya." It was the first time any of them had used my name without a hint of condescension. I just gave a sharp, formal nod in his direction. "Let's move," I said, turning on my heel and leading them down the corridor. The signing itself was a tense, surreal affair. I stood by the door, arms crossed, my expression impassive. The lawyers fussed over the documents, the pens were produced, and the signatures that would salvage my father's legacy were scrawled onto the heavy paper. My father looked up at me once, a desperate, searching look in his eyes. He was looking for something. Absolution, perhaps, or a sign of the daughter he used to know. Gave him nothing. I was a United States Marine and I was on duty. When it was over, we reversed the process. They were escorted back to the Sally port. As they were about to get into their car, my mother stopped. She turned to me, her face a mess of conflicting emotions. "Anya, we thank you." The words sounded hollow, brittle. They were the right words, but they came years too late and were born of necessity, not of love. I could have said, "You're welcome." I could have offered some small, conciliatory gesture. But the woman I was now wouldn't allow it. I stood at attention, my posture rigid. "The United States Marine Corps is pleased to have been of service, ma'am," I said, my voice ringing with military formality. The use of ma'am was a deliberate choice. It was respectful, professional, and it put an unbridgeable distance between us. It was a blade, and I saw from the look in her eyes that it had found its mark. She flinched as if struck. My father simply got in the car. Julian paused one last time. He looked from my face to the flag flying high above the embassy roof. He gave me a small, sad nod of understanding, and then he was gone. The heavy steel gate slid shut, and they were gone back to their world. I stood there for a long moment in the quiet of the Sally port, the smell of exhaust fumes hanging in the air. I had faced them. I had controlled the situation. I had done my duty. But there was no triumph, no sweet taste of revenge. There was only the hollow, quiet echo of what could have been. In the days that followed the signing, a fragile truce settled over Khazar. The lockdown eased slightly, enough for foreign nationals to be evacuated. My family was long gone, back to their world of victory parties and shareholder meetings. I remained in mine, the world of concrete walls and constant vigilance. I threw myself into my work, into the rigid routine of embassy duty, but the confrontation had left a crack in my carefully constructed armor. I found myself in the embassy gym late one night, not lifting weights, but punishing a heavy bag, sweat stinging my eyes, trying to exorcise the ghosts of the past week. The rhythmic thud of my gloves against the leather was the only sound in the cavernous room. "You're going to break a hand if you keep that up." The voice rumbled from the doorway. It was Gunnery Sergeant Thorne. He hadn't left Cavadia yet. He was staying until the security situation was fully stabilized. He walked over, not with his usual intimidating stride, but with a quiet, almost gentle gait. He stood beside me as I let my arms drop, breathing heavily. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't need to. The whole embassy had been buzzing with the story of the detachment commander's high-powered family and the dramatic rescue of their billion-dollar deal. "Heard you had some family visit," he said. His eyes fixed on the swinging heavy bag. I just nodded, unable to speak. "They don't get it, do they?" he said, more a statement than a question. "People like them. They live in a world built on our backs, and they don't even see the foundation. They look at you and they don't see a Marine. They see a disappointment." His words were so accurate, so perceptive, that it felt like he had reached into my chest and pulled out the very core of my pain. A tear I didn't know was there escaped and traced a path through the grime on my cheek. He didn't pretend not to see it. He just reached out and put a heavy, calloused hand on my shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of pity. It was a gesture of solidarity. "You did good, Sterling," he said, his voice low and firm. "You held the line. Not for them. For the uniform. That's all that matters." He squeezed my shoulder once, then turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. And in that moment I realized something profound. The validation I had spent my entire life craving from my father, I had just received it from Gunnery Sergeant Thorne. And it meant infinitely more. A week later I received an email. It wasn't from my parents. I hadn't heard a word from them, and I didn't expect to. It was from Julian. The subject line just said, "Anya." The email was long, surprisingly candid, and painfully honest. He wrote about the flight home from Cavadia, about the suffocating silence in the cabin. He said our parents didn't speak a word the entire way. They just stared out the window, their victory tasting like ash. He wrote about seeing me in the embassy in my element in command. He said for the first time, he hadn't seen his weird, rebellious little sister. He had seen a leader. He had seen the strength they had all mistaken for weakness. "I was so proud of you," he wrote, and so deeply ashamed of myself. Of all of us. We never saw you, Anya. We were so blinded by what we wanted you to be that we never saw the incredible woman you were becoming. He went on to say that the incident had been a wake-up call for him. He was resigning from Sterling Global Strategies. He didn't want the legacy if it meant becoming our father. He wanted to find his own path, something real, something he could be proud of. He ended the email by asking if, when my tour was over and I was back in the States, he could come and visit me. Properly this time. Not as the Sterling heir visiting his wayward sister, but just as a brother. As I read the words, a genuine smile spread across my face for the first time in weeks. Maybe one bridge wasn't burned beyond repair. Maybe one piece of my old life could be salvaged and rebuilt into something new, something better. Months passed. My tour in Cavadia came to an end. The country was still fragile, but it was on a path to stability. My father's deal, I heard through the grapevine, was proceeding. I was reassigned to Quantico, Virginia, to become an instructor for the next generation of Marine security guards. I was teaching them how to fortify an embassy, how to stand a post, how to be the calm in the storm. I was passing on the lessons Gunny Thorne had taught me. I stood before a class of young, eager Marines, their faces a mixture of awe and nervousness, and I saw myself. I saw the hunger for purpose, for a mission that mattered. I realized that my family's rejection had been a gift. It had forced me to find my own strength, to build my own family, to define my own honor. I no longer needed their approval. I no longer needed their validation. My worth wasn't something they could grant or withhold. It was something I had forged myself, in the fires of Paris Island and the lonely vigils of embassy duty. The peace I felt wasn't the peace of victory or vengeance. It was the quiet, solid peace of self-acceptance. I was Sergeant Anya Sterling of the United States Marine Corps. And I was finally completely home. My name is Anya Sterling, and my story isn't really about my family's spectacular failure of vision, or about the sweet, ironic justice of them needing the very thing they despised. It's about the journey to understanding a fundamental truth. Your value is not a reflection in someone else's eyes, especially not the eyes of those who refuse to see you. It's a fire you kindle within yourself. Sometimes the people who are supposed to lift you up are the ones who hold you down, and breaking free from them isn't an act of rebellion, but an act of survival. The greatest strength often comes not from meeting the expectations of others, but from fiercely, bravely, and unapologetically defining your own. Have you ever had to forge your own path, away from the expectations of your family? Share your story in the comments below, because every one of us who has walked that road knows how lonely it can be, and how important it is to know you're not alone. Don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the most unexpected places. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Remember that family is defined by love and respect, not just by blood. I wish you all the strength to build the life you deserve.